All right. Hello, everybody. Eric Bischoff here with another special edition here on 83 Weeks, the 83 Weeks YouTube channel. Had a great intro last week. Brad Balukjian in his new book, Six Pack. We got into a lot of interesting details and learned a few things about people that I thought I knew everything there was to know about. But today, we're going to talk about the expansion of WWE, WWF back in the day, coming off of WrestleMania 1. Brad, how are you, buddy?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. Today's launch day, so it's been quite a marathon today, but I'm jazzed to finish it off here with you with a bang. And I don't know about you. Do you, Eric? Do you like? I still have a hard time saying WWE. Do you? Does that catch in your? Are you used to it now?
Oh yeah, I'm used to it. I oftentimes though, when I know we're going to be talking about WWF before the brand name change, I always, refer to both WWF and WWE. But I've kind of gotten to the point now where WWE rolls off the tip of my tongue.
Yeah.
More so than WWF. But I do that from time to time just to keep things in context.
Of course, context is king.
Absolutely. We've got some new members here at 83 Weeks. Carl Hayes, thank you for joining us. Carl Bramblett, David Hernandez, newest members here at 83 Weeks, but a lot of other people joining us here. We're going to take some questions throughout the show about Brad's book and some of the things that come up. So I encourage you, do not be shy. Do not be shy. Jump in. If you've got something you want to make a comment on, or you've got a question, that's what we're here for. Super Dave Silva, our producer, crack producer, standing by, and he's going to help us out if he sees something interesting, because sometimes I get caught up in what I'm talking about. It's hard to read comments as they come. So Super Dave, if you see anything that looks relevant, just pop it right up, man. You can interrupt me or Brad, either one of us. We don't care. We're here to have some fun.
My pleasure.
So Brad, where are we? We're coming off WrestleMania 1. Let's set the stage for us, buddy.
Well, let's go back. So WrestleMania 1, March 31st, 1985, right? That's kind of where I ended things in terms of really doing my deep dive in this book. So there's a lot more that could be said after WrestleMania 1. But I think what we want to chop up today is the story of Vince, as he takes ownership of the company and what he does initially. Vincent Kennedy McMahon. I know some fans hate when people say Vince Jr. So Vincent K versus Vincent J.
I used to call him Junior all the time, like when I was in WCW and I wanted to get under his skin, because sometimes and really what I was doing is entertaining myself. I wasn't getting under anybody's skin, but I was having fun.
Did you ever
call him Junior?
Did you ever actually have a direct conversation with him in those peak years in WCW? No,
never did. Would have been a fun conversation though.
Can you imagine if like social media had been around back then, right?
Oh, I would have messed with him so bad. Because my and it wasn't just for kicks, because I did it a lot for fun, like practical jokes and canceling his hotel room, like at the big back in the day, the NAPTE convention, NAPTE, so National Association of Television Programming Directors, whatever it was. But it used to be, back when syndication was a big damn deal and a major part of television, they'd have this big convention every year, and it would move around, but they had it in Las Vegas. And a friend of mine who's no longer with us, his name is Zane Bresloff, he worked for me. He's a super guy, and he used to work in WWE, so he knew a few people there, good relationships. And we were in Las Vegas. This big convention was going to go on in Las Vegas, and Zane knew when Vince was coming in. Somehow he'd gotten that information from inside one of his contacts at WWE. So after a cocktail or two, Zane wasn't a drinker, but I had a couple cocktails while I was watching him place bets at the sports bar at the, what was the name of that hotel? Can't think of it right now. Doesn't matter. But we were sitting in this hotel, and Zane was at the sports bar trying to make some money. I was having a couple cocktails, getting excited. Somehow the conversation came up, and Zane said, "Hey, you know where Vince is staying? He's staying down at Treasure Island." I was at the MGM Grand, and I don't know whose idea it was. I think it was Zane's, but I'll take credit for it. Said we should cancel his room. We should pretend that we're with his office and we're calling to cancel his room, so that when he gets there, because all the rooms were already booked, it was a big convention, that would just be a great way to start his week off, canceling his room. So we did. never heard about. I never told him I did that either. Vince, if you're listening, you got to admit it was a good joke. Come on.
Yeah, I know. So we're going to talk about Hulk Hogan next week, but I wanted to just point one thing out that I think a lot of people knocked Hulk back in the 80s and 90s in that first WWF run because they said, oh, he didn't work hard enough in the ring, or his schedule wasn't, he only wrestled 3 days a week. He didn't have the dates the other guys did. And I'm bringing this up because you brought up NAPT, which is that convention. And I've seen, and I'm going to share this through the QR code in my book, through my website. I have a bunch of internal documents from Hulk in 89, 90 that show what his schedule was like, including overseas tours. And this what people don't realize is that when he wasn't wrestling so many times, he was doing appearances, like going to the NAPT convention, or, not to mention all the Make-A-Wish stuff. And, Hulk was like always having to do some PR appearances when he wasn't wrestling. And so, I think it's unfortunate that people have this misconception that, he just didn't wrestle as much in those years, because he was on the road just as much.
I've heard the stories, and I'm anxious to see that schedule. And what people don't realize is that making those appearances and being on, especially at big conventions like NAPT or a licensing convention, any big convention, when you're the star, at that time, there was no bigger star than Hulk Hogan. I don't know when the Sports Illustrated cover came out in relationship to this conversation.
85.
He was a massive star. And when you're the star of the show at a convention like that, it is more draining than a 1-hour Broadway match, because you're on. You have to be on for 6, 8, 10 hours and be courteous to everybody. And you're selling, you're constantly on. And it's probably as or more draining in some ways than a match.
Yeah.
The ring is, and I've heard Hulk say this before, and I'm sure other, wrestlers of his stature probably feel the same way. I know Ric Flair does. The only time they can really relax and feel at home is in the ring wrestling.
Yeah.
Because they're in control of the situation, and that's what they do. So, yeah, I'm with you. And the other thing that people don't realize is the style in Japan was completely different. You go back and watch some of Hulk Hogan's matches when he was working in Japan. I mean, he was chain wrestling. Keep in mind, this guy is 275, 285, 300 pounds. He was a big dude back then. There weren't many people as big as Hulk Hogan back in that day, and that were wrestling. And he was in there chain wrestling with some of the best.
Right.
It's just the styles were different, and I think people, for whatever reason, look, when you're at the top, everybody wants to take a shot. So I think Hulk used to do it.
There's a question here I see from Coach Rosie. Who is a current wrestler that would be perfect for the time period after WrestleMania 1? So that's an interesting question. So WrestleMania 1, we come out of that with Hogan having been champion for a year, teaming up with Mr. T. He ends up doing a feud with Randy Savage, which often people don't think about. They think about the later one with the Mega Powers, but when Savage came in, they did a feud. But I'm thinking, it's an interesting question. Like, who does anyone jump to mind that from the current period that maybe would have fit that style back then?
It's just, almost every time I get asked a question like this, the answer is inevitably the same. I think Randy Orton.
Yeah.
Randy Orton can work any style, and he's a great character, but when it comes to in-ring work, I don't think there's been anybody better. I shouldn't say better. Shawn Michaels and Randy Orton, in my opinion, are two of the best in the last 30 years. And I think Randy would have fit into that era as well. He's a big guy. Shawn probably wouldn't have. He was pretty small, and the audience wasn't really getting with smaller guys until afterwards, I believe.
And
certainly Randy.
To your point, Eric, Hulk actually did feud with his dad right around that time. So, I'm sure Randy, his dad, Cowboy Bob, was a big star, and wrestled Hulk on Saturday Night's Main Event and all that. So it's not a big stretch to think about Randy being in that same.
Have you ever interviewed Bob Orton?
I haven't. I'm going to be at WrestleCon this weekend, and I saw he's going to be there, so I hope to get to meet him.
Man, if you get a chance, go out of your way, and especially if you happen to catch him somewhere where you can have a conversation. Number one, he's just a great guy. I really enjoy being around him, and he's got amazing stories that you don't often hear about.
Yeah.
Do yourself a favor if you can.
Well, the Iron Sheik, I remember the Iron Sheik told me a story about saving his ass at a bar in the South once, when Cowboy Bob was cowboying up a little too much with one of the local ladies in the bar, and Kaz had to get involved. But anyway, so back to well, I think also this period we're talking about, so Vince buys the company. Someone mentioned this in the chat in 1982, in June of 82, buys the company from his dad and his dad's shareholders, which included Arnold Skaaland and Gorilla Monsoon, and was it Zacco, the other one? I'm drawing a blank there. But what's crazy, so in this book, I was able to track down Jim Troy, who maybe he's given one interview before, but Jim Troy is not. And Silva, if you can pull up a picture, I think I have a picture of Jim Troy with Vince from that era. Yeah, there's Jim Troy and Vince McMahon, probably like 1986 or so. And Jim was a guy that was Vince's right-hand man, basically.
Was he a hockey player?
He was a hockey player. Vince met him. So hockey plays a really interesting role in this whole Vince story, in that, Vince had the Cape Cod Coliseum. That was the building he and Linda ran starting in 1979. And they just needed revenue. And they brought in a hockey team called the Cape Cod Buccaneers. And Jim Troy was a player on that team. And when Jim had gotten badly injured and basically his hockey career was done, but he and Vince got along so well that Vince said, hey, why don't you come join me? I'm going to do this national expansion, and you can be my senior vice president. And Jim was one of the only people, it was Jim, Linda, and Vince that hopped on a plane from Hyannis in Massachusetts to New York City in June of 82 to give the down payment on the WWF. And they literally carried $230,000 in cash in their briefcases to meet at the Warwick Hotel to give that money over. And the condition was that Vince had to make the next 3 payments within 1 year, or the company reverted back to the original owners.
Okay, so what was the structure of the deal? The $230,000 sounds like an installment.
Yeah, and then it was 4 installments, basically for $1 million total. And so Vince had to come up with, another 250 3 more times.
All right. Speaking of money, I want to jump right in here. Mo, your handguard. I really hope I didn't butcher that name, Mo. And number one, really appreciate you. Super chat. We love you for that, brother. You jump right to the front of the line when you do that kind of fun stuff. Mr. Bischoff, completely unrelated, but I just wanted to thank you for providing the best era of wrestling. WCW 96-98 was the greatest period in wrestling, in my opinion. Thank you so much. I think I love this channel. When people actually, spend money to tell you thank you. I was born for this. Thank you, Mo. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's always fun to hear. Always fun to hear. Wasn't Jim Troy kind of a badass too? I think I remember that. It was kind of one of the reasons that Vince liked him, because he was a real physical guy. He wasn't just I don't know how much of a business person he was, really. Sounded like perhaps, since Vince knew he was going to be dragging around $230,000 in a briefcase, he wanted a little backup. I want to bring a hockey player.
So now, so now that the book, the 6-pack, is out, people, skip ahead, read chapter 5 if you want, which is what we're focusing on tonight. And in there, you'll hear, there's a great story, to Eric's point, when the WWF was on tour in the Middle East, and basically Jim Troy was the agent in charge of that whole tour. And they, this was in Kuwait, I believe, and the Kuwaitis were not going to pay the last chunk of money that they owed the WWF. And so Jim Troy says to them, well, if you don't pay, we're not going to put the guys on the show tomorrow night. And things got really ugly. There's a Kuwaiti prince involved. There's an Egyptian bodyguard that Jim Troy gets in a fight with. Wow. just absolutely nuts. And in the end, they paid Jim Troy the money because he took care of business with his fists. And I guess Vince and Linda, they needed the money back in Greenwich, Connecticut to make payroll, because this is like 1983, 84. Now, keep in mind, people talk about the expansion and how Vince raided all these territories, and that's all true. But think about how much money it cost to expand, right? Like, your revenue is going up, but so are your costs. And so, Vince had a revenue challenge and problem at that point. And that's why he did things like went over to the Middle East for a tour. As I'm sure you've heard, Eric, when he went around going to the local TV station managers, he was offering them money to play their program, their syndicated program, instead of the local show. And Jim Troy was the guy that Vince sent on the road, along with Joe Perkins, another guy from back then, to go talk to the station managers and do all that. And they would have all these, and this is all in the book. They would talk about how they would like get advertising, these like call-in advertising spots. Then, like, if the number of people that called in, translated to a certain amount of money they would get. They had all these deals of ways to get revenue, because in those early years, you're bringing in Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff and all these guys from the other territories. Well, now you have to pay all these guys, right? So
yeah, and keep in mind, back in the day, we're talking about syndication here now, and syndication, you don't really hear people talk about it much, but the business model for syndication was a producer, in this case Vince McMahon and WWF. They have their 1 hour show, and they would go to a local television market and try to convince the station manager or program director to air that show in what was typically a barter, which means if there are 12 commercials in a 1 hour show, the station would get 6 minutes, and then Vince would retain 6 minutes. It was the same model that Vern Gagne had, and it's how I started in the business, was in syndication.
Right.
That's a great deal if you have an ad sales team in place that can allow you, as the producer, in this case Vince, to monetize those 6 minutes. They didn't have that.
Yeah.
The revenue from those television shows were primarily from the live events that Vince would promote more than likely once a month or once every 8 weeks in that particular market. So there was not a lot of money into this. Is way before the big television licensing deals and things like that. So I can see why they were scraping together every manner and way they could to create revenue with those 6 minutes of program time.
Right.
Commercial time. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt you. Just want to make a clarification.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because some of our viewers may not even know that, the syndication backstory. And that was he said that was the advertisement to drive traffic to the live events. That was the hallmark of the business back then.
That was the bread and butter. Nobody, Vern Gagne, even Vince McMahon back in the day, probably never could have imagined that a station manager would pay you to put your wrestling show on the air. That would be like, what? What kind of universe is this? Can't happen.
Yeah. So 83, Vince, really in 83 is when Vince starts making his moves, middle of 83. And that's when he gets ready to move from Cape Cod to Connecticut, near New York City, Greenwich, Connecticut. Silva, if we have I went during my road trip for the book, I went and found the office building where the WWF was located back in 1983. There it is, 81 Holly Hill Lane. Building looks pretty much the same, apparently, from what it looked like back then. It's a pretty average looking office building. And I actually was able to go inside. They left it unlocked, and I was walking around, and that was Vince's corner office. He had the corner office, and Jim Barnett and all these guys that were in that building. And we hear a lot about how Vince recruited and raided other territories for wrestlers, but he did that with the office talent as well. And he made a lot of moves to bring people in. Like, he knew where he needed help, right? He knew he needed to surround himself with smart, talented people. For example, the magazine world. Up until then, the WWF had outsourced their magazine. there wasn't really a, what we think of as the WWF magazine. It was just a kind of a more local thing. And he recruited two people, Ed Holinsky, an editor, and Steve Taylor, a photographer, who ended up being with the company for many, many years.
And we talked about Steve Taylor and his involvement with Hulk Hogan last week.
Right. And it was Hulk Hogan that actually, it was Steve Taylor that actually passed Vince's business card to Hulk Hogan at an AWA show that said, "Call me." And then, Hulk got on the phone with Vince, and the rest is history. So Vince brings in Ed Holinsky and Steve Taylor to run a new magazine called Victory, and this is the beginning of, if you go back and you look at some of the documents from this era, up until that point, Vince would allow other photographers from other magazines to come in. And now he said, okay, I'm only going to allow, certain photographers who work for my magazine to be at events. I don't want anyone just coming in and taking pictures of whatever. He started asserting control over every aspect of the business. And when he named it Victory Magazine, there was another series of magazines that was, I think it was the After magazines, that said it was called like a Victory Sport Series. And because the word victory was in the name, somebody threatened to sue Vince for using victory in his magazine title. So that's when Vince, after only 2 issues, scrapped it and created WWF Magazine.
Wow, this is some trivia contest stuff here, folks. So, if you run a trivia thing, I work with a guy that runs best trivia ever. Does these trivia contests all over the country. Does 2,500 to 3,000 of them a year, or something crazy like that. And it's all, when he has me come in, it's all wrestling questions. So I would encourage anybody who's into trivia, especially wrestling trivia, pay attention. Write notes.
So it seems like a small thing. Okay, start a magazine, but it's really symbolic of everything else, right? Where now Vince is taking control of his own thing, and no outsiders. And I was able to also meet with later publishers and editors of the magazine, and they told me that it was really frustrating for them because Vince would often come in and change the story.
No, really?
So well before he was doing that on Monday Night Raw scripts, he was doing that for his own magazine, and would want to change this or that. And there was one mistake that one of the editor told me about, where because the magazine would go to press before, well before a particular pay-per-view or something, and he let slide that Randy Savage, he referred to him as the WWF champion before he had won the championship, and he was worried he was going to be fired over that. But I guess that was the case where Vince he said well, don't let it happen again, that kind of thing. But
he had the potential to be gracious, but you just never knew when it was going to come.
Yeah. And the just looking at the history of how, even so WrestleMania 1, right? We talked last week about some of the myth busting that I do in this book. And one of the myths that I bust is that Howard Finkel came up with the name for WrestleMania. What I didn't put in the book, and what I haven't really shared this much before, is that there was a meeting at that office building that we just showed on the screen in late 1984, and Vince was, they would do these monthly shows at Madison Square Garden, and Vince wanted to do a bigger show. He was familiar with closed captioning, closed circuit, because he had run the Evel Knievel Canyon Jump in the 70s, and he had also promoted I think it was the Antonio Inoki Muhammad Ali boxer versus wrestler fight in the 70s. And he said, okay, closed circuit, that's the big thing we need to use. So he's like, we need to have a big event, and let's do it in Madison Square Garden, and let's call it something different. This is, the precursor to pay-per-view. So I guess he's in a board meeting, and he's there, and George Scott, who was the booker, longtime promoter in the Mid-Atlantic territory, is there. And he was a guy that Vince really trusted. And Vince said, "All right, we're going to call it the Colossal Tussle." And the room goes silent. And George Scott, who was one of the few guys who wasn't afraid to push back on Vince, said, "Vince, that is so stupid." He like laughed, kind of embarrassed Vince. And later, so the conversation continued, and ultimately, an obscure PR guy named Rex Jones came up with WrestleMania. But just think, Eric, if it wasn't for George Scott laughing at Vince, we could be on the eve of the Colossal Tussle 40 right now.
Ooh, that's horrible. So much for the creative genius. Some of that is really a myth. We've got Jason Rempel here. Jason, thank you so much for your question. We appreciate it. The question is very simple. Is WWE the hottest it's been in years? Two answers to that, yes and no. Yes, financially, they're in a whole different stratosphere. You can't compare the numbers today to any other previous numbers of any years, particularly when you're going back into the 70s, or excuse me, the 80s that we're talking about now, and 90s. So yes, financially, yes. Here in the United States, there are probably fewer people watching wrestling. That'll be a controversial statement to make, because we all know there's a lot of different ways that people get their entertainment content, and it's sometimes hard to track. But I think it's safe to say that in the US, you may not have as many people watching as there was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But the footprint, the WWE footprint, is now so large, and the distribution internationally and the revenue that comes from it is taking it to a whole different level. So it is indeed. But I want to thank you, Jason. Super chat is very much appreciated. Thank you, bud.
All right.
Where were
I
we?
want to, so another guy so there's a question here. Is the book out? Yeah, the book is out today. So please check it out, thebradpack.com. You can get it on Amazon, anywhere books are sold. It is out in the world. And please let me know what you think after you give it a look.
Have you had any like pre-sale numbers, or any indication how the book's moving in pre-sale?
I know that so I don't get those numbers from my publisher directly, but I just looking on Amazon, which sells half of all books. Today, my book was number 3. I was behind Becky Lynch's hardcover and her audiobook, but I was number 3, like right there, right? So I mean, obviously,
that's kind of a big deal, because Becky Lynch's book is getting a ton of publicity right now.
Right. I mean, I'm in Philadelphia now. I went down to the Barnes and Noble where she was signing, and there was a line of 400 people at the Barnes and Noble waiting for her. So, I can't quite compete with that, but hey, if I'm in sniffing distance, that's not bad.
You're in the conversation. That's impressive as hell. So let's make sure everybody listening to this goes out and gets you to number 1 here shortly.
Thank you. So, there's a question here. Why do you think that the promoters didn't push back on Vince's expansion? Oh, they definitely did. And maybe, I don't know if you can talk about that, Eric, or I can talk about it too.
Well, of course they did. I only know what I was told when I first broke into the business. Of course, I heard all the stories, but Vern Gagne and the people that worked with Vern, they tried desperately to push back. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, so there are stories. I don't know. I remember Hulk Hogan, shared a story once of apparently, Harley Race confronting him in the locker room in Kansas City with a gun. And, I don't know if you've ever asked him about that, Eric. I don't know if that's true.
I've heard the story. Hulk was taking a dump. Harley came in and was going to shoot him. Hulk talked him out of it. Thank goodness.
I mean, this was not, it was rough. I mean, Vince was, there was a story that Jim Troy shared. I don't remember the details, but it was in Puerto Rico where they were in there and they were jumping off balconies, ducking gunfire, he said. I mean, some crazy stuff with, the other promoters not wanting them around. And they fought, I mean, Vern. So Vern offered to buy Vince offered to buy the AWA from Vern in 1983. Mm-hmm. And apparently the number that he offered was insulting to Vern. And so Vern said, hell no. At that time, Vern had Hulk Hogan. And I think when he rebuffed Vince, Vince really wanted to stick it up his ass then. And he, shortly after, he was able to poach Hulk Hogan
through Steve Taylor.
And Vern then, after Hulk committed to, so Hulk was in Japan and sends Vern a telegram that says, I'm not coming back. And Vern thought it was a rib. He thought, because, people would play ribs all the time and whatever. And so Hulk, it really was true. And then Vern continued to advertise Hulk for shows around Christmas time in 1983, knowing that he wasn't going to be there. And that, I think, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way as a, just a kind of a, not
especially because Hulk Hogan was so, I mean, I lived in Minneapolis at the time. I remember Hulk was like a phenom. So to advertise him and not deliver him, ouch.
Well, and that's, again, people often, I think they've even got the t-shirts, Hulkamania established January 23rd, 1984. Again, sorry to bust the myths, but Hulkamania started really in 1981 or 82, after he went back to the AWA after filming the Rocky movie. And right. Vern brought him back as a heel. And kind of like the Hollywood Hogan thing in 2002, when he came back with the NWO, and, the fans just wouldn't have it, right? I mean, I don't think the plan was to turn Hulk Hogan babyface in 2002 for a long time, if at all. In 1981 or 82, when he went to the AWA, the fans did the same thing. They're like, we don't want to boo this guy. And then Hulkamania, it was in full swing in the AWA, wrestling Nick Bockwinkel and Ken Patera and David Schultz. And he, he was so over. I mean, he was as over as he was with the WWF, and he was, but they wouldn't put the championship on him. That was one of the things, I think, that, when Vince went and flew to Minneapolis and met with Terry, with Hulk, and he said, I'm going to make you the champion. That, I think, is what convinced Terry to jump ship.
No, and in my conversations with Terry, with Hulk, the other side, the other part of that, I think that was true. What you said is true. It wasn't the only issue. The biggest issue to Hulk, according to my conversations with him multiple times, was that Vern didn't want to share merchandise. Hulk was smart enough early on. And you got to remember, this is before merchandise really mattered to anybody. There was nobody selling enough merchandise for it to be a big issue. But it was to Hulk. Like Vince, who, you say whatever you want about Vince McMahon, the man was clearly a visionary when it came to this industry.
Right.
Hulk was not too far behind him.
Well, and that's why when people get into the like Vince or Hulk, it's like they both needed each other. Like Vince couldn't have done this without Hulk. Hulk needed Vince's,
absolutely.
And they're really inseparable in the credit there.
David Doss, super chat. Thank you, brother, so very much. I'm glad you're with us tonight. I hope you're enjoying this show. It's a lot of really cool information here. Grew up watching the NWO and WCW from 96 to 98. They were great years with many great memories. Thank you for giving us some of the greatest wrestling years in wrestling. I almost got that right. Thank you so much, brother. It was, I was blessed. So it's that simple. I was just blessed. Right place, right time, right situation. Right hair. Come on. Got to admit. You got to admit it. But I thank you very much for that. And thanks again, more than anything, for joining us here tonight.
Are you going to let it come all the way back in, Eric?
No. You know why? Because it's thinner now. My hair used to be really thick and coarse and heavy.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of thin. Now, I'm not bald. I don't have any bald spots, but the hair itself is thin. So when it gets long, I start looking like Bernie Sanders. That frizzy flyaway white hair. It's fucking ridiculous.
I think you should grow the Hollywood Hogan thing now and have the dyed black with a.
Ooh. I could look like a wrestling character everywhere I go. Awesome.
Well, back to Vern for a second. I interviewed your buddy Brad Reagans for the book. An underrated guy in the history of wrestling, for sure. I mean,
very much so.
He trained Brock Lesnar, I believe.
Yes, he did.
And before that, though, he was a good hand in AWA and WWF. And he told me, he was buddies with Terry, with Hulk in those early years, and he would ride with him. And he said that Vern would really ride Hogan. Like, I mean, he would really lay into him and call him, like, kind of berate him, and really call him. I think Terry's a pretty sensitive guy.
He's extremely sensitive.
And so, and Vern would be like, "You dumb shit," and he would kind of just, like, when he was training him, and Vern does deserve a lot of credit for helping to show Terry the psychology of wrestling and how to work the crowd. I mean, Terry had a lot of that from music and his rock and roll days. I mean, truly, like, that's a shoot. He really, people who, I mean, yes, Terry's exaggerated his music career over the years, but he was a good musician. He made a full-time living off of music before wrestling. And he knew, I talked to the guys he was in the band with, he knew better than any of them how to work the crowd, but he needed to refine that under Vern, and Vern did understand psychology. And so he helped Terry a lot. But in the process, Brad Reagan said he really would just kind of mistreat him in the way he would talk to him. And I think that really, got under Hulk's skin.
I can imagine it would, knowing Hulk. I mean, look, it gets under everybody's skin, it's human nature. Nobody likes to be talked down to or berated or embarrassed, especially in front of your peers. And, I worked for Vern long enough. I saw him lose his temper more than once in a large group of people, and he could go off.
Yeah. So I think when you have the merchandise thing, you have that part, all of this adds up and I still think Terry had mixed feelings about leaving. I mean, he was grateful to Vern to give him that break. I mean, Hulk he had a nice little run in WWF when he first came up, but not like he was over with the AWA.
No, and you also have to remember Vince Jr. taking over the territory from his father. That was not like a sure thing. Vince is no longer there, but you got a call now from Paul Levesque or Nick Khan or Ari Emanuel, you hope you get that call, but it's different now. Back then Hulk was taking a risk, he was burning a bridge, and in Vern's territory was one of the best territories in that time for talent. They made a ton of money and they didn't have to work every night. It was a monthly territory, not a weekly territory. So there was less travel, more time at home, more money. It was really one of the better territories to work in. So it wasn't just, Hulk's relationship there and his friendships and feeling at home there. It was also kind of a big risk to take that money from Vince Jr.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, I want to mention I was able to track down the accountant that's actually not doing it justice, the CFO for the WWF starting in 1983, a guy named Bob McMullen. And I want to just read a quick thing from the book here, where I talked to Bob McMullen. He said, the WWF wasn't sophisticated. When Vince bought out his dad in 1982, he had not consolidated the two companies, Capital Wrestling and Titan Sports. With money moving between the two entities, valuations got confusing. McMullen put an end to that, discontinuing Capital. He also introduced audited financial statements, opening the door to the McMahons getting a much-needed line of credit through the Bank of Boston. McMullen ushered in a lot of positive change, witnessing the company grow from less than $10 million in gross revenue to $63.1 million in 1985. And in 1988, after he was gone, the company passed $100 million.
Wow.
So I know you like the business aspect of things, Eric. So that just shows you how quickly the company grew. But also, when this guy came in and was shown the books, they didn't have a line of credit. They didn't have audited financial statements. They hadn't combined the two companies. I mean, again, Vince deserves credit for his vision, but he needed people like Bob McMullen to actually keep the books going.
No, and I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of the journey and the growth of the period of time we're talking about here, because Vince McMahon was learning on the job. He was more of a promoter / creative type than he was a CFO type. And if you're not familiar with setting up your companies and you don't know the ins and outs of tax structure and lines of credit, and you don't see the value in having audited books, you have to surround yourself with people that know more than you do in that particular era. And I think someone like Vince, anytime I think an executive, an entrepreneur recognizes their weak spots and makes moves to fill them and strengthen those positions, that takes a certain kind of brilliance in and of itself and strength. And speaking of brilliance and strength, Real Number 9 Media, what would Vern Gagne think of Tony Khan? Oh, God. Oh, it'd be like, Jesus, what is that guy? Oh, my Jesus. He would have been embarrassed. Let's put it that way. He would have been embarrassed. Thank you, Real Number 9 Media. Appreciate that super chat very, very much.
There's also a guy named Nelson Sweglar. Do you know that name, Eric?
Yeah, Nelson Sweglar. Zane used to talk about him a lot. Gene Okerlund, who also worked for Vern for a long time, made that move as well.
Yeah, so the younger gentleman there is Sean Mooney. So the viewers don't confuse. But the older guy in the upper left, that's Nelson Sweglar.
Yeah, I had a lot of, Gene Okerlund really respected Nelson a lot and tried to convince me a couple times. I think Nelson had already retired, but he was kind of half-ass interested in coming to WCW back around 93, 94. And Gene was pushing him pretty hard. Never made that move, though.
So Nelson was so we all know the name Kevin Dunn, right?
Sure.
So Kevin Dunn's father was the guy who ran TV production for Vince for Vince Sr., Vincent J. McMahon before Kevin. Kevin was like right out of college around 1983, 84. And until that point, the WWF had contracted with Kevin Dunn's father to do the syndication. And this is, again, an example where Vince, he realized, I'm going to build this thing national. I need more expertise. I need better production values. He recruited Nelson Sweglar to come in along with Kevin Dunn to redo their TV look and to spruce it up. And this was no Monday Nitro, Eric, but it was still an improvement over what they had. And so, people that are familiar with the show Tuesday Night Titans, I was able to talk to Nelson about that. And this is an example where Vince was like, Vince would have ideas. He's like, well, what if we had a Tonight Show set where I would be there and I would interview the wrestlers, and that was kind of the extent of the idea. And it was up to Nelson to take Vince's idea and turn that into reality. And so he came up with the whole set, and they would, if you watch those old episodes, the studio audience was like 30 WWF employees that were asked to stay late from work, right?
I used to have a Nelson Sweglar. His name was David Crockett.
Yeah,
I'd pop off some idea that I got excited about, and then David have to go try to make reality out of it. It was brutal.
Right. So Primetime Wrestling, TNT, All American Wrestling. These are the USA Network shows, and again, it all comes together because the person. So we, Monday Night Raw, right? That was last night in Brooklyn on the USA Network. Well, that whole relationship started in 1983 when our friend Jim Troy, who we were just talking about, makes the introduction with Vince to Kay Koplovitz, who was the head of USA programming. She didn't like wrestling, but they won her over by saying, well, our product is more family friendly. And, to this day, there's that relationship. But so cable, we talked about syndication. Cable, right, was another strategy for Vince to go national. And we all know that Ted Turner, the TBS had done that first with their Georgia Championship Wrestling. And then there's the whole story in 1984 when Vince actually bought Georgia Championship Wrestling in a kind of a midnight hour behind the scenes sort of double cross from the Briscoe brothers, who sold him controlling shares of the company. And then what was crazy in the book, I talk about how, according to the CFO of the WWF, when Vince bought Georgia Championship Wrestling, it wasn't even actual money. It was what he called notes, like basically an IOU. And I had never heard that before. But again, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors that went into this national expansion.
We're going to take a couple questions here while you're taking a drink. Intelligent Observer. Thank you very much, Mr. Intelligent Observer. Why wasn't the Sandman used more in WWE and WCW? Oh, hell, I don't know. I guess because nobody really saw him as a major character, but an important supporting cast member. Perhaps that's a good answer. I don't know. Let's take another one here. Talvish, been a supporter since '97. Keep up the good work. Thank you, brother. I appreciate that very much. I really appreciate that. We're going to do one more. Alex Tuckwild, or Allison. I'm sorry, Allison. Thank you, Allison, for the super chat. My cat. What? My cat is start this year instead of next year. Talking about a partnership startup this year instead of next year. Okay. But I love you, Allison. Thank you so much for the chat. We're going to do one more. David Hernandez.
It's one of those voice to text that got screwed up, maybe.
Yeah, or somebody's partying. Allison, are you having fun? You could have invited me. In your opinion, oh no, this is Ask Brad. This is your question, Brad.
Well, I think it's both of us, but we could both take it. It's a great question. It's timely with WrestleMania. Colossal Tussle 40 coming up.
Yeah, you take it. What's your answer?
Which Hulk Hogan match is the most enjoyable to watch in WrestleMania history and why? I can't say this is a particularly original answer, but it's got to be WrestleMania 18 with The Rock. I mean, Eric,
say that.
I think that's maybe my favorite wrestling match of all time. I mean, I've never seen that is a better example of the audience's power, the sort of democratic nature of professional wrestling is best on display in that match.
I agree with you. And they had to call an audible. They had to shift gears because of it, because the crowd was telling them no. They were cheering Hulk, and they did everything they could to prevent that. It just wasn't about to happen. Kind of like the fans of Minneapolis back in 1983. They just weren't going to buy him as a heel.
Exactly. Yes. I'm trying to think of like if there's a runner-up for that. Well, I think his match with Savage at WrestleMania 5 is one of his better. Well, and the Warrior. I mean, that was another iconic match.
Yeah, and Andre. I mean, come on.
Yeah,
that was a pivot point.
I would love maybe if I write a sequel to the Six Pack, I would love to dig into WrestleMania 2 because that show is weird, right? Where they had the 3 different venues. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember it, but I read about it, obviously know about it, but I didn't see it.
It's classic Vince, right? Where he comes off WrestleMania 1, which was an unqualified success. The rumors and innuendo, as Conrad would like to say, about him mortgaging everything on WrestleMania 1, I think that's a little bit exaggerated, everybody, just to let you know. Bob McMullen, the CFO, told me that he never saw Vince put a nickel of his own money in the company, which is interesting. So it's not like Vince was going to be, panhandling on in Greenwich, Connecticut if WrestleMania 1 had failed, but it didn't fail. It succeeded enormously. And in classic Vince fashion, his response was, all right, well, now we're going to do 3 venues this year, right? And we're going to have Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. And the fact they never did that again tells you how successful that was.
Everything we need to know.
Yeah. All right. Let's what else did I want to cover? I hope people will check out the bradpack.com. Eric, we talked about this last week. I made a plea to my publisher, and I have a big New York publisher, it's a major corporation. And I said, guys, like, we need to bring a book into the 21st century and have all this additional material that goes into researching a book available to readers. Like, let's use a QR code in the book, and that can open up all this additional material, because we know wrestling fans are die hard. Eric, you did this in your book. I did this in my book. My publisher was like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. But I still think to this day that if a major publisher got behind this and like actually marketed it, because you need to have marketing, you need to have money.
Yeah, you need to educate the audience, the
right.
customer, because this is Your book, I mean, I did it in my book thanks to you because I asked you if I could steal your idea and kind of do a trial run with it. And it's a big damn deal. I mean, there's very few books that are out there. I've found some that if you're reading about, advanced electronics, and there'll be a QR code so you can look at a schematic. But in terms of additional content and supporting content for a book like you wrote, this doesn't exist. It's kind of a big damn deal. This could change the book business.
Well, I mean, imagine if Taylor Swift wrote a book and if the publisher said, special edition for $3 more, you get the special edition that includes a QR code with exclusive tracks of Taylor Swift. You're not going to find anywhere else, right? It's like, but you'd have to market it as like, this is the way DVDs marketed their special editions and director's cuts and special features. You could do that with a book and you can make a shit ton of money doing that. And I for the life of me, I can't figure out why that's anyway. I was
going to ask you, I mean, it's just because and I know you don't want to, throw any shade on your publisher, and you shouldn't, but I wonder why the resistance to it. I mean, there's no risk.
Well, I think it's because, I mean, you and Guy did your own thing with your book because you can go direct to the readers, right? And there's a lot to be said for that. In these big publishing contracts, these publishers their margins these days are pretty slim. So they're all like, we're so overworked, we can't dedicate the resources to developing the infrastructure. But when you get down to it, they're just very risk averse. That's right. That world. But all that to say, if people go to thebradpack.com or they scan their QR code in the back of my book, they're going to see some stuff you've never seen before. And so, Silva, if we could bring up so I was able to get my hands on Vince McMahon Sr., Vincent J. McMahon's planner from 1963. And here's an example of a page. So this is before, in January of 1963, the WWF didn't even exist. I mean, the WWF didn't even exist yet. It was called Capital Wrestling. It wasn't until April of 1963 that Buddy Rogers became the first WWF champion. And so this journal is showing the matches that happened in the different venues in January of 1983. Now, I went online, I looked at the history of WWE website. Nobody has any record recorded of these events happening. And now for the first time, we have the matches, and you can see, these names, Arnold Skoland and Pedro Morales and Antonino Rocca, John Tolos, who wrestled who. So that'll be up there. Also, I have, if we pull up the advanced ticket sales document, this is like really deep in the weeds, but really cool. You'll never find this anywhere. Internal from the WWF servers, the actual attendance and the box office for different house shows at different times. So just one example here in the middle, that's the Providence Civic Center. And you can look at, how much each show grossed and what the attendance was, and even the advanced ticket sales over 4 or 5 weeks leading up to the event. Wow. So if you're interested in the business of wrestling and you want to know, well, how did this Hulk Hogan match draw versus this match, you can go and analyze that. So please, check out, obviously I couldn't put all this stuff in the book, but it's all out there through the special features.
All right. I'm going to throw, while you're gathering yourself and getting ready to transition, I'm going to knock out a couple more questions because we love our super chatters. Thank you so much. Allison is back, and Allison wants to know, I'm talking about in the 80s and 90s, old story about Owen Hart accident, and then just talking. So if you want to listen to that kind of soul, come by him. He knows everything, something like that. Okay, Allison. Whatever, girl. Okay, I'm with you. Infinite Chase. Thoughts on TK booking ROH Supercard of Honor the same weekend and city as WrestleMania the last 3 years? Smart business, opportunistic, or just petty? I don't think it's petty. Look, you're going to have a huge density of wrestling fans that are looking for something to do. And if you can squeeze in a card and take advantage of so many wrestling fans, because you got wrestling fans from all over the world It's not just a domestic U.S. audience or local Philadelphia audience. You're going to, if you walk around that building that entire weekend, you walk around anywhere, you're going to meet wrestling fans from the Middle East, from Japan, all over Europe, South America. I mean, it's a big damn deal. And, Tony's not the only one that stages different types of wrestling events in and around WrestleMania. So, it's probably a smart move. No harm, no foul. Thank you, Infinite Chase. Appreciate the question, brother.
All right. Let's do a little thing where, Eric, we talked about this last week that, part of the goal of this book was to look at these guys as people, right? The human side of wrestlers. And as part of that, I went deep into their history and was able to find some of their pictures, their high school yearbook photos.
Oh, this is fun.
As I researched, went into their hometowns and talked to the people they grew up with. So Silva's going to flash a couple of pictures here, and you tell me which wrestler this is, their high school yearbook photo. So,
I'm good at this.
Go ahead, Silva. Pull up that guy.
Dave Anderson. No, I don't know. I'm just looking at the name of him.
Okay, here's a hint. High school at Princeton, Minnesota.
Oh, Bob Backlund.
Bobby Backlund, yes. And there actually was going to be, I don't know if I told you this, Eric, I was going to do a chapter on Bob. And I actually went to Princeton and I saw where he grew up and I spent a nice afternoon with all of his high school buddies, spent some time with his biographer and sat with him. And it didn't end up, like, the book was running long anyway. Obviously, I wanted Bob's story in there because he's the guy that Iron Sheik beat to become the champion. And then, and then Hulk becomes the champion after that. But, from my reporting, it seems like Bob is dealing with some pretty serious health issues and, maybe some dementia sort of thing. And so, I just knew that, like, that wasn't going to be in the cards to talk to him, unfortunately. But I was still able to do some reporting and some research. And so that was, he was a star amateur wrestler. So
interestingly enough, on Facebook, there's a Facebook group called I Used to Wrestle in Minnesota or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I wrestled in Minnesota. And it's just, a bunch of old codgers like me that used to amateur wrestle in Minnesota, and they keep a little network together. And somebody posted, this was just last week, I was looking through it, and somebody posted a tournament that featured high school Bob Backlund in this tournament. I think it was a state tournament.
Oh, wow.
It might have been his sophomore or junior year because he actually lost. He didn't win the championship. I just saw Bob's name pop up there out of Princeton, Minnesota. Princeton's north of Minneapolis, about 60 or 70 miles. When Bob lived there, it was like very, very rural. It's probably nothing more than a suburb of Minneapolis now, but it was central Minnesota. It was quite a ways up there. Holy smokes, Allison, you're on a roll. Thank you so much. Wrestling with the Devil is that top show I forgot to put in there. But then after this, I'll put it to rest. But a woman with binoculars said it looked like someone pushed a shadow, but I don't think anything of it. Well, I wish I could contribute a little bit more to that, Allison, but thank you so much for joining the show and being a super chatter.
I have a feeling Allison's going to look at her bank account tomorrow morning and be like, wait, what was that?
That's okay. Keep them coming, Allison. We love you for it.
It's like in the old days when you go out to the bar and then, you maybe you ended up with the receipt in your wallet in the next morning and you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Ooh.
Don't remember the shots 9 through 11 there. Okay. So, one question, Eric, did Terry Holt ever talk to you about Backlund? Because Backlund said some pretty harsh things about him, and I wondered if Terry ever, what he thought.
I mean, we never really talked about Bob Backlund that I can recall. Never really came up. Yeah. Well, why was there heat there, do you think? Well, I know why, because Hulk wasn't an amateur wrestler.
No, but also, like, you got to remember that that Bob. Okay, so my book is about the extent to which these guys became their characters, right? Bob Backlund, ironically, had no character, but Bob Backlund became Bob Backlund in the sense that he bought hook, line, and sinker into his character, which was the virtuous All-American
Howdy doody.
babyface. And I think that's because Bob had a really abusive, and he has barely spoken about this, a really abusive childhood, terrible. His father was very abusive. And I think Bob was very angry and insecure. And I think having that character he was, say what you will about Bob Backlund, he was champion for 6 years. And to be champion for 6 years, you got to be doing something right. And people idolized him. I mean, in the 70s, a lot of kids, he was like Hulk Hogan minus all the charisma, right? He was like the train, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins without the over the top thing. And I don't think he liked that Hulk was a showman. And at the same time, as Hulk has openly said, Hulk also partied, and I don't think that Bob liked that. I think he thought he was a hypocrite.
In a way, kind of like early Kaz.
Yeah.
That looked, I don't want to say naive because that's not right, but you know what I mean? Just almost such a virtuous perspective, of an athlete.
He took himself too seriously. I mean, I think you have to separate the character from the person, right? And none of these characters, Hulk Hogan, Bob Backlund, any of these babyface characters, they're characters. They're virtuous, they're perfect, but no human is those things. And I think, I think that was something that Terry Bollea has struggled with is, reconciling the flawed human that he is with the superhero that he was and still is to so many people, and realizing like it's okay to be both, right? It's okay to be flawed.
And we talked about that a little bit last week when you're talking about how a wrestling character can affect someone's life. Again, this is in a period of time when kayfabe and protecting the business and staying in character in public, this was a requisite. This was a priority. If you didn't protect the business, you wouldn't be champion for 6 years. You wouldn't be champion for 6 minutes. If promoters thought you weren't there to protect, because you're protecting their business, you're protecting their revenue when you protect the business. And I think that was such an important aspect of it. Then you get someone like Bob Backlund who comes at it from he was a virtuous person. He was an athlete. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't party. He was howdy doody. He was like a badass howdy doody, but he was howdy doody. Right. And I can see the conflict there. It was even Vern. I think that's you talk about how Vern treated Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, the person. I think that's also a part of it. There was a jealousy there. It's hard for someone like Bob Backlund or Vern Gagne, who came up as an amateur wrestler, an Olympic team, and played. He got drafted by the Green Bay Packers at one point, a legitimate athlete. And then you see somebody like Terry Bollea, who played baseball in high school, but was basically a bass player in a rock and roll band, come in and command so much response from the audience. It's kind of hard, It's hard.
Well, also, do you remember that Vince asked Bob to turn heel? And that really rubbed him the wrong way. He wanted him to dye his hair and feud with Hogan. And Bob again bought into his character so much that he was like, okay, here's a good parallel. Bob Backlund in 1984 is to Hulk Hogan in 1996. And they chose radically different paths, right?
Right.
Bob said, nope, I'm not going to turn my back on the fans. And we all know Hulk said, told the fans, you can stick it.
Screw you, fans. Yeah.
You can call this the New World Order of Wrestling, brother. And that was it. Okay. Silva, do you have another high school yearbook photo? All right. Who's this handsome gentleman?
I don't know. Give me a hint.
From Parts Unknown. That is Demolition Axe or Bill Eadie.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, which, actually we never really saw Bill Eadie's face. So it's actually hard to know what he looks like because he was always under a mask or he had face paint on. But Brownsville, Pennsylvania, he was a good football and track player that was able to go to Brownsville and find people from his childhood. So very, very cool.
What's the most fascinating thing you learned about Bill Eadie?
Ooh, that his first job after he quit wrestling was to be a security guard for a bunch of strip clubs. And one of his bouncers got shot when he threw a guy out for being too handsy with the talent. And that person came back in and shot him. And when that happened, Bill was like, he's like, man, I can't live with this pressure on my conscience. He's like, I thought pro wrestling was shady, strip clubs, a whole nother thing. And then he went on and became a teacher in like a reform school, which is, he really loved.
Bill Eadie kind of danced right up to the edge of being one of the bigger names in the business. I mean, it was just I think it was just a matter of timing with Bill. And
yeah,
he
Bill
didn't reach to that superstar level, but man, he was so close.
And I think part of that is Bill was, because he was a teacher and a psychology teacher before he was a wrestler, he knew he had something to fall back on, and he had a wife that like wasn't necessarily that jazzed about him being gone all the time. So I think whereas some guys would have been like, oh, well, because for the longest time, the WWF wanted him to come in, and he only came in 1983 as the Masked Superstar because he was good friends with Andre the Giant. And Andre the Giant kept telling him, come in, come work with Vince. And Bill just liked Japan because he could go to Japan just like Hulk for 10 weeks and make, 80 grand or something. I mean, he was making huge money. And so I think Bill was never willing to completely go into the business because he had other priorities.
That'll do it, because Vince McMahon wants 110% of you.
Yes.
He wants your waking hours, your sleeping hours. He wants 100% commitment.
We have two more. For Dave, if you can put one of those up.
Tito Santana.
So it's funny how the times have changed, Eric. And I was looking at the Mission High School yearbook in Texas. That's where Tito grew up, from like 1970 something. And they, back in those days, they would have those honorifics like most likely to succeed, but they actually had ones like best looking and best person. Can you imagine, with the way that society is now, with everyone being offended? Like, what if you had like best looking in your yearbook? It'd be immediate cancellation immediately.
Yeah, that won't fly.
But Tito was best looking in, I think, Mission High School in the year.
You did a great job of covering. I mean, you brought Tito to life as well, talking a lot about his family and where he grew up and how he grew up. And when I read your book, one of the fun things about reading your book, as I said last week, you have a very cinematic style. And for someone like me who isn't an avid reader recreationally, it's hard to hold my attention. But the way you write, it was like I was watching a movie. It was like there was a movie going on in my head while I'm reading.
Yeah,
it was that good. But you spend so much time allowing us to feel like we were in the neighborhood. We were part of the community. You gave us a sense of the community that someone like Tito lived in as much as anything else. And it just gives you a different feel for the characters and the subjects you talk about. Thanks.
Yeah, because place is important, and place matters when you're storytelling, right? It provides environment and context, and I think it explains things when you can understand what a place looks like.
In Tito's case, where he grew up and the way you described it, it actually becomes a character in the book.
Yeah, well, if we have our way, Eric, one day with your help, we will have a movie for.
We will do that, won't we?
Project. So we have one more to put up there. You know this one.
I know that. Everybody knows that one. That picture's been all over the place.
So
young Terry Bollea.
Yeah. So, and what was funny was, so this was out of Danny Brower, his friend's yearbook, and what I should have included this too, but it actually had the thing where Terry wrote a message in his yearbook, right, and signed it Terry, and so back then everyone was still signing each other's yearbooks, and he wrote something like you're cool as shit or something. It was pretty basic, but good stuff.
Look at that head of hair.
I know.
Kevin Oshiro's been pointing that out. I'm looking at the chats. Is Hulk Hogan's hair, brother? That's awesome.
I think you have a question here, Eric, from Frank.
Oh, I don't see it. Hold on. Let me scroll down here and get to it. Oh, there it is. Frank, I'm not even going to try that one, brother. I hope you could forgive me because I would just butcher it. Hey, Eric.
Mitzi Caritas.
Mitzi Caritas. I can repeat it. I just can't read it. Hey, Eric, I'm a recent 83 Weeks listener. When and why did your relationship with Tony Khan start to go sour? Happened about 2.5 years ago, November, 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And I'm driving back from Minnesota, and I don't know, somebody called me or I read it somewhere where Tony Khan made this comment. He said, if Ted Turner knew 1% about professional wrestling as I do, WCW would still be around today. Just pissed me off. It was such a disrespectful thing to say that I just decided at that point in time I was just going to treat Tony Khan like I would treat anybody else that says stupid shit. That was it. Didn't take much with me. Disrespect someone that I have a lot of respect for. Oh, God, I have a hard time getting over it. It's a flaw. I'm not proud of it. It's a flaw. And I try to improve. I don't know that I will. I'm getting old. There's only so much you can change. But I'll keep trying. You never know.
All right. Anything else, Eric, that you want to cover from the expansion or?
I don't know, but Michael McCormick just bought a copy of the book and looking forward to reading it. Thank you, Mike McCormick. That's why we were here. I saw a couple other people on social media mention that they recently purchased the book because of the interview that we did last week, the show we did last week. So
thank you.
I appreciate
Eric,
it.
I mean, you all know, you people that are watching here know how great Eric is, but when I first reached out to Eric, you didn't know me at all. It wasn't like I had some insider wrestling contact, and you were so gracious to just take my question and have a chat, and I really appreciate everything you've done just to get the word out.
My pleasure. What are we going to talk about next time, Brad?
We are talking about Terry Bollea. We are going to, we're going to get into some of what and the way that I approached that chapter. So, I knew I had a chapter to write about Hulk Hogan, and it's like, well, how do you write something new about Hulk Hogan when, everyone knows everything apparently. But I was able to go down to Port Tampa, Florida and find some new sources. And so we're going to talk about that, and, we'll talk about your relationship with Hulk, and it should be a lot of fun.
I'm looking forward to that. We've got one more super chat. It's Yeah Man. Hi, Eric. I was wondering if you knew what kind of editing software was used to make all those flashy video packages back in the 90s. I absolutely do not. I wish I did, but I have no idea. I don't really get along well with software. I'm not that guy. Like, one of the reasons I don't get new phones, unless I'm forced to, is because I just don't like having to transfer stuff and go through the process. So I avoid technology as much as possible, which is harder and harder to do every day. But you know what? Yeah, man. I want to thank you so much for joining. Thanks everybody else for joining us here. If you haven't ordered the book yet, go to Amazon. Go to your local bookstore. If they don't have it, ask for it. Make a loud noise when you ask for it. Say, hey, I'm looking for the 6-pack. Where is it? It's a cool wrestling book. Maybe they'll order it, put it on the shelf. But seriously, order the book. You're going to be fascinated with what you learn. If you're like me, you'll put down that book when you're done reading it, and you'll feel like you actually know these characters, like you kind of grew up with them in a way, and you know a lot about their lives. You have a different appreciation for them, which is another reason I love this book.
What's fun, Eric, is that I did grow up, like we did grow up with these guys, but now you're getting to see the real person behind the character on TV, right? And that I think is, people ask me a lot, because I've written about baseball players and wrestlers, and they say, do you regret, is it disappointing to understand how flawed they are? And I'm like, no, it's the opposite. It's like, it makes me feel closer to them because they're human, right? like that vulnerability makes you feel more of a connection to them than you did before. So
it makes them richer characters. If you look at the Marvel characters and the superhero characters that are in Marvel movies and all the things that Marvel produces, all those characters have some kind of a weakness. They've got a flaw. Some of their battles are inner battles. Their inner battles are sometimes more challenging than their outward battles.
And we'll come back to this next week, but I really believe that part of why Hulk Hogan was so successful is because he was so good at selling and he was so vulnerable.
Yep.
He wasn't the Brock Lesnar 4-minute, I'm indestructible. He was like on his back for much of the match. And that's
fighting from underneath.
That's relatable, right?
Yep. All right, brother. I appreciate it very much, Brad. I'm looking forward to next week. Of course, I'm going to be in Australia next week, so we'll be doing it the following week, I believe. We're going to be talking all about Hulk Hogan. Looking forward to that one.
Yeah, me too. All right.
All right. Brad, thank you very much. Super Dave Silva, thank you. Thanks to everybody that joined us here tonight, your super chatters. We really love you and appreciate you being with us. And again, go out, get the book, 6-pack. You'll be glad you did. See you next time, Brad.
Thanks.